start by focusing today on the object of our search. Namely, what is the thing for which we are searching? Wisdom. How do we understand what is a really complex topic? Ask anyone, there's some videos of this on YouTube, ask anyone on the street, what is wisdom? And you'll find quite a range of answers, and oftentimes a real sense that defining this term, giving texture to this quality or this attribute, is actually quite difficult. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time today really focusing on what is this thing wisdom we're seeking, definitional question. And I'm going to do so through the particular lens of Israelite wisdom literature. And I'll say more about what that means in just a moment. But as a beginning point, I want to start with this image of the tree. The tree, this particular tree, some of you may know this tree or even have seen this tree. I'm seeing a few nods. This is the angel oak, which is found on Johns Island near Charleston, South Carolina. This tree is a southern live oak. I myself have not seen this tree in real life, but several students have called my attention to it over the years when we've talked about this metaphor for wisdom, that wisdom is like a tree. And I'm going to give even more texture to that in a moment. But this image of this angel oak is about 400 to 500 years old. It is approximately 66 feet tall. It's 28 feet in circumference. And it produces shade, which is hard for me to imagine, of over 17,000 square feet. It's just a massive tree. Its longest branch, as I understand it, is about 187 feet. So this is a massive, you can see online a number of images where the branches themselves go down into the dirt and rise up again. It is woven deeply into its environment. This incredible tree is, as you might imagine, the survivor of a number of storms and disasters over centuries, hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. And yet this tree somehow has found a way to recover, to heal when it's been damaged, and to continue, at least as last reports had it, to continue to grow. And so if we have this image on the screen, I want us to think a little bit about what a tree as a metaphor for wisdom might suggest. Now, why a tree? We're going to see in a moment, Proverbs chapter 3 associates wisdom with a tree. And we're going to see tomorrow that's a bit in the book of Sirach, which I'll talk about as well. We also get a very vivid, incredible poem describing wisdom as really the tree of all trees, a tree that reflects the finest of vines and trees and the lushness of Israel and its environment. So it's appropriate to start by asking a question about the tree. Let's think a little bit, you might actually jot your own notes about what a tree invites for you in thinking about wisdom. You might, for example, think about rootedness, that wisdom is rooted in its environment. It arises out of its place. There's something deeply connected and stabilizing about wisdom's connection to its local context. You might also think about wisdom as organic, as alive, as changing, not as tired or fixed moralisms, for example, but as something that's actually changing, maturing, developing, growing in response to its environment. So wisdom isn't a fixed thing, it's rather an alive and moving thing, a breathing thing. You might also think about the fact that trees are often fruitful, and we're going to see this aspect of a tree gets picked up certainly by the ancient sages who were thinking about wisdom, the fruitfulness of a tree. And that can be whether it's flowering fruitfulness or it's fruit, and the varieties which trees might produce. Wisdom offers as a tree the fruit that is nourishing and sustaining for life. So this is about nourishment as well. You might also think about resiliency. Wisdom has an ability to weather the storms of a community over time. And when we talk about proverbs, we're usually talking about sayings or wise instructions that have found traction in the life of a community over time. You might say something really witty and really wise right now, but if the community doesn't pick it up and give it its own legs in the life of the community, it's a wise comment, but it's not necessarily a proverb. Proverb has duration, a durative value in the life of a community. So this resilience, the ways in which trees are resilient. You might also think about the fact that trees are adaptive to their seasons. This is part of the resiliency piece, but there are times when trees will be barren and times where trees will be lush and fruitful. And that's not a flaw, that's built into the rhythm of the tree's engagement with the environment itself. So wisdom adapts to the environment around it. We could also talk about aesthetic beauty. A tree is, I have a tree, actually a Japanese maple, right outside of my study window. And I find its aesthetic just so pleasing. It isn't so much about its rootedness or its fruitfulness, it's just beautiful to look at. And the variety of trees and the beauty that they offer is an aspect of wisdom. Wisdom is exquisite speech, it's fitting words, it resonates. We talk about proverbs singing in their context. There's a resonance and a beauty to wise sayings. You might also talk about the ways in which trees offer space or shade in which to dwell. So trees as structures, architecture, that actually provides comfort, protection, space for people to dwell. And we'll see that there are depictions of people sort of living in the tree of wisdom. This is a safe harbor amid the storms of life. There's a lot more we could do with this image of the tree, but I wanted to start with bringing together through this image, which we will develop far more fully tomorrow afternoon. This image, some of the ways in which wisdom affords a kind of contextual pertinence and permanence, an adaptability, a responsiveness, and a vitality, beauty, variety that we want to unpack in our time together. So now I'm going to move to the next slide. Let's see if it'll let me do it. Okay, so now we'll move from the Angel Oak in South Carolina and move in particular to this image of the tree in the ancient world. And the text that you see on your slide, wisdom is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her, is found in Proverbs 3. And what you see in terms of images on this screen are images of what was an iconographic image of a tree of nourishment, a tree of life found across the ancient Near East. Now on the right-hand side, you have a sketch. This is from a northern shrine called Contillet Ajrud, dates to about the late 9th, early 8th century. And in this depiction of the tree of life, this sacred tree, you see some of the aspects of this that's so remarkable. The tree is fruitful. Its branches are extended and growing outward. And at the end of its branches, it's bearing fruit or flowers. It is clearly in bloom. And what you will often see, as you see in both of the depictions of the tree of life, you will also see usually animals, ibexes, sort of a mix of animals up next to the tree, and in many cases trying to partake of the tree, to eat of the tree's fruit. So this is an image, this image of a sacred tree, a fruitful tree, a tree of life, was certainly known to ancient Israel and is found across the ancient Near East. Now, I'm going to pause for just a second. When you think about the tree of life, I expect at least one text comes immediately to mind. And if I could unmute you all, I would. Well, this is where we would be talking to one another. But I will trust that when I say the tree of life, many, if not all of you, go immediately to the Garden of Eden. We first hear about the tree of life in Genesis 2 and 3, where it is one of two trees that God plants in the garden, full of all these other, it's interesting, full of all these other trees that are both good for food and beautiful to look at. God in Genesis 2 and 3 also cares about the aesthetic beauty of these trees. There are these two trees, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Now, what you know is the story that follows. Really, the tree of knowledge of good and evil becomes the tree of concern in the story. But there is at the end, after the human couple have discovered have eaten of the fruit and their eyes have been opened and they see their nakedness and they feel shame. There's blame, there is a sort of alienation from body, self, and serpent. They are expelled from the garden in no small way because God also says they might also eat of the tree of life. At the end of the Genesis 2:3 story, do we have access to the tree of life? We do not. God expels Adam and Eve, and God sets up a flaming sword and a cherubim to guard the tree, guard this garden, so that we might never return to it. So by the time we get to Genesis 4 in the Old Testament, we can no longer have access to the tree of life. There's one other place in the Christian canon where you have reference to the tree of life. And that is Revelation 22, the very last chapter of Revelation. So you start at Genesis and flip to the other end of your Bible, open it up. Revelation 22 is describes this sort of apocalyptic, beyond end time description of, and the tree of life is straddling the river of life. It blooms monthly, it offers a different fruit every month, and its leaves are healing for the nations. So this is an image of an end time with the return of the river and the tree that provides healing and nourishment for all peoples, for the well-being of all. So we have the tree of life in Genesis, and we have the tree of life in Revelation, where it is also inaccessible to us in the present moment. We can't, that's an end time beyond our time. The only other place in the canon where we have reference to the tree of life is in Proverbs. And Proverbs 3 says, wisdom is this tree of life. You hold on to her, you seek her, you partake of her fruits, as we'll see. Ben Sirach develops this at length. What is not available to us in Genesis, not available to us yet in Revelation, is standing, as Proverbs will describe it, right in the center of downtown. That you can walk up, embrace her, partake of her, and be nourished. She is the tree of life. So this image of the tree is going to be really important as we move into tomorrow, the kind of seeker of wisdom and what it is exactly we are searching for. Okay, let's move into, so what is this? Now we've got this tree of life imagery. Let's talk a little bit about wisdom as a phenomenon for ancient Israel. And so here's where I'm going to kind of walk through the definitional pieces of this with, I hope, in your minds, this image of an organic, living, changing being, this tree. The first thing to say is when we ask the question, what is wisdom? Those of us who work in my little corner of the universe, Dr. Hankins knows this corner of the universe, we're talking about a kind of mix of things. Various things come to mind when we ask the question, what is wisdom? One thing that comes immediately to mind is we're talking about a tradition and a family of texts. So this is, we could say immediately that every culture has a wisdom tradition. Every culture has expressions of wisdom. But when we're talking about this within within our canon and thinking about it particularly for ancient Israel, we're talking about probably an oral tradition, certainly an oral tradition that eventually begins to be written down to where we have a collection of texts that we now turn to or point to that we identify with this tradition. Now, ancient Israel was not unique in these kinds of texts. We have a wisdom text from across the ancient Near East, Egypt, Babylon, Mesopotamia. We have, those of us who work in these texts often have the wisdom of these other cultures on our desks because, as I will talk about in a little bit, of the very vivid exchange of ideas among the crafters of these texts. This is a tradition and a family of texts readily associated with a group of people we call sages, wise persons, and scribes. And you see a statue, a figure of one of these scribes or sages on your screen. These were persons who had a particular worldview or perspective, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But Israel had an expression of this in its texts, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. So when we mentioned this morning, when we say wisdom literature of the Old Testament, those are the books we're thinking about. We will also spend time tomorrow, especially, in texts that Protestants consider apocryphal or hidden things. Many of our Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters in the faith call these texts deuterocanonical or secondarily canonical. So you would go to a Roman Catholic church, for example, and hear a sermon on Sirach. These are texts that have secondary canonical value, and they are critically important. So the text of Sirach, there's a portion of Baruch, a wisdom poem tucked into the middle of the book of Baruch, and the book of wisdom of Solomon, which is in the 1st century. I'll say more about this a little bit later. But for those of us who are tracing this tradition and thinking about the development of ideas, we might start at Job or Proverbs, depending if we're thinking chronologically, sequentially, and we'll move all the way through, tracing the story of wisdom and Israel's engagement of it through to wisdom of Solomon and into the New Testament and beyond, which is another conversation. So how do we answer the question first, what is wisdom? We answer it first by saying it's a tradition associated readily with sages and scribes that manifests itself in particular texts. So wisdom is also, to the second point, a worldview. It's a perspective. A sage begins with a question, a certain point of orientation, asking the question, what is good for the human in life? Notice this is a starting point that is very much human and communal centric. It's starting from a place of, as I look out at the world in which I live, what is good for us to navigate, to steer, to find our way in the world, in our daily living, our daily tasks, full of challenges and full of joys. The tradition responds to that question, what is good for the human, drawing largely on experience, human experience. This is the tradition scripturally that places a high value on human experience as a source of revelation. This is that we learn something about how to be creatures of God in the world God created from our experience and the experience of others. And so we place experience as a vital resource for figuring out how exactly we should make our way in the world. Part of what's really important for wisdom, and also I think probably a sticking point for people who are trying to read this literature sometimes for the first time, is that wisdom really is about both knowledge and application. This is the practical know-how portion of the scriptures. This is also why, at least in my experience, a lot of Protestants today, or at least people in so-called mainline congregations like my own, This is often why we don't preach or teach or talk about these texts very often, particularly Proverbs, because it feels like these are kind of obvious, maybe even secular, if I can use that term, sayings. They feel kind of like obvious. How is it that you navigate in the marketplace? How is it that you, how should you speak? When should you speak? To whom should you speak? Those kinds of concerns. But here's the point. The moment we say that practical know-how for everyday, ordinary interactions is somehow secular or not theological, we have missed the point. For ancient Israel, every interaction is charged with faith. Every interaction is an experience or an encounter with the world that God formed. And our behavior, our action, our speech, the ways we enter every engagement reflect who we are and whose we are. So ancient Israel understood everything we do to have profound theological relevance. There was no distinction between sacred and secular. So let me move one more step. This is literature that thinks about addressing the question of what is good for the human in life by starting from what we would call theology from below. And the contrast is theology from above, right? If you think about the best sort of image for theology from above is to think about the giving of the law at Sinai. God writes with a finger on the tablet so that the people might have the gift of the covenant, the gift of the commandments of God that will shape them as a community of faith, as a priestly nation and a holy people. That's really theology from above. Wisdom starts from below. Wisdom starts from navigating the world and drawing from experience. And part of what's at the heart of this paying attention to the world is the search. I have a type A personality, which you are probably getting to know. Part of what may draw me to this literature is it's a search for some sort of coherence, some sort of structure, some sort of way in which the world is organized in its deepest structures. I can give an example. Martin Luther King, one of his speeches, talks about the arc of history as long, but it bends towards justice. That's a very famous Martin Luther King quote. That is an expression of a notion of structures and movement. We may not see justice in our lifetime. Our children might not see justice, but there is a structure in the shaping of the world that is moving historically in the direction of justice. The world, that is, in this perception, is not neutral. The world is bending. And ancient Israel would say is bending because God created the world and God is not neutral. God's justice bends the structures towards goodness and wisdom and wholeness. So now you might ask yourself, or I'll ask you, what then are our sources of wisdom? Where do we go to find it? Well, ancient Israel said what key place you go to learn wisdom, to seek this out, is your elders. Proverbs 16:31 reads, "Gray hair is a crown of glory." So everyone who has gray hair here knows well. It is a crown of glory. You may not feel that way, but it is a crown of glory gained in a righteous life, is how the proverb finishes. The argument here being, and you can imagine certainly in the ancient world, with lifespans remarkably more brief, that simply to have survived life, to have lived to an old age, is an indication of some hard-earned wisdom. It's a demonstration of the capacity to have a kind of street smarts, a kind of resilience, a kind of capacity to read the world and find your way in it. That is a hallmark of being wise. So I find this really important to emphasize it in the seminary classroom, to say in a culture, in a US culture that so privileges youth, glorifies youth, This is a tradition that insists you turn to your elders and seek their wisdom. It's been hard earned. The ancient sages would also say you look to artisans, craftspeople, who have a certain expertise that reflects an earned wisdom. So shipbuilders and metal workers and weavers and the professional mourning women who were part of Israelite society, metal workers, all those who work with their hands and find ways to create. That is a reflection of wisdom. That is something to be studied and learned. Another place where ancient Israel says you must look to learn wisdom is the natural world. So now if you have your Bibles, and will you turn with me to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6 is the first of many what we call go to the ant proverbs. And it's a boy, if biblical scholars can have a little bit of lingo, a little inside code, that's one of our inside codes in a very small corner of biblical scholarship. Go to the ant. It is a phrase that holds all of these various proverbs that say, turn to the natural world to watch the creatures of the natural world and learn something about how to be a creature of God in the world. So if you look at Proverbs 6, go to verse 6, and I'll read this text, but I'm going to show you one other one because I just think these are really important to be paying attention to in our own time of ecological struggle. Go to the ant, you lazy bones. Proverbs 6 begins, consider its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, the ant prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest. How long will you lie there, O lazy bones? When are you going to rise up from your slumber? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands and rest, and poverty will come upon you. Okay, so if we had more time, I'd want to unpack this proverb at more length. But what you notice is the turn is to say, when we think about industriousness, when we think about managing time, paying attention to the fact that there are seasons of scarcity and there are seasons of fertility, and one needs to regulate one's work in light of that rhythm of the universe. This proverb and proverbs like it say the natural world is imbued with an integrity in and of itself that will teach us, also as creatures formed by God, something about what it is to be wise. One other place, go to the other end of Proverbs, Proverbs 30. And let's look at one more of these just so you see it. I'm in Proverbs 30, verse 24 and following. This is what we call a numerical proverb. It builds on a number system, 1, then 2, or 3, then 4. And here we have a proverb about 4 things that are really small, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants, we're back to the ants. You can see why the ants are really big. The ants are a big thing. The ants are a people without strength, yet they provide their food in the summer. The badgers are a people without power, yet they make their homes in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. The lizard, or the spider, depending on your translation, can be grasped in the hand, yet it's found in the king's palaces. Notice, even the most small, unassuming, we barely pay attention to it kind of creature is held up here not only as having a quality that is something to be esteemed, but is also held up as teaching us a people that can teach us something about what it is to be a wise creature of God. One last comment I'll make on that text. That is the only text in the book of Proverbs that imagines a world without a king. The locusts have no king, and yet they can organize themselves. Every other text in Proverbs assumes the necessity of a king. Not so in the world of the creatures. Lastly, vitally important to the tradition, is the notion that wisdom is to be sought in the cultures, in other cultures, in surrounding peoples. God made the whole world and all of its creatures and all of its communities, and we therefore rightly turn to the wisdom of other cultures to learn more wisdom. You see this played out in Proverbs, for example, the last two towards the end of the book, the text I preached on this morning. You might remember if you heard it. I mentioned Agur in Proverbs 30 is not Israelite. We have instruction in Proverbs 31, 1-9, that is attributed to a queen mother, not of an Israelite king, but of King Lemuel, who's also understood to be Massite, not Israelite. Portions of Proverbs seem to be much like Egyptian wisdom, particularly Proverbs 22-24. Parallels an Egyptian text called the Menemope. What is the point? The point is, just as Queen Sheba came to see Solomon, who had prayed for wisdom, asked for wisdom, is the quintessential sage of ancient Israel, even as there was sort of a coming to him to learn his wisdom by peoples from all around ancient Israel, so too, if we seek wisdom, our search must take us to the wisdom of other cultures. If you're looking for kind of an interfaith or an ecumenical impulse in Israel, it is there early, manifest in this tradition in our canon. I'll sort of close on this slide by noting some examples of themes or concerns that wisdom takes as part of its work. You already know we're thinking about the ordinary everyday. You already know we're thinking about how is it one navigates life and what is good for the human. Well, immediately you're going to find a lot of the wisdom tradition is about matters that arise out of our everyday experience. How is it that we interact with our neighbors? How is it that we care for our families? One of the biggest concerns in the book of Proverbs is speech. When do we speak? Who do we speak? How do we speak? And the power of words to both do grievous harm and to be life-giving and healing. I think perhaps in this day of social media and shaming, this kind of move to this virulent these speech patterns we have. These are texts that remind us that unlike the sort of contemporary proverb, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words could never hurt me. Ancient Israel would look us all in the face and say, we know better. Words can harm, words can destroy, as much as words can be a healing balm. So speech is really a critical topic in these texts. You also find economics, money, how to navigate in the marketplace. One of the most striking things to me when I was studying Proverbs was that one of the abominations to Yahweh sayings that we get in the book, what is an abomination to God? That which makes God sick, makes God, if I can push the point, be nauseous. It is the slight little things we do to get a little advantage. It's the false weights and measures in the marketplace. That's an abomination to God, where we think we can just skim a little, cut a little, do a little less, and to our benefit and to the detriment of our neighbor. That kind of interaction is a cause for great distress to Yahweh. So we also, of course, have all sorts of wrestling with power and authority. Why do people suffer? Why think of Job, for example, here especially. Why is it that good people, innocent people, suffer? Wrestling in the book of Kohelet with the reality of death and the finality of death and what that then might suggest to us about how to live. You're getting a sense, there's lots more topics to think about, but you're getting a sense of the driving concerns rising in no small way out of this worldview, this perspective. I'll I'm watching our time. I'll refer just briefly here. You can imagine just skimming these books. You are keenly aware that wisdom, when we ask the question, what is wisdom? We also will immediately say for ancient Israel, it's a kind of discourse, it's a kind of speech. that includes within it a variety of different genres. So I give you a number of examples here that you can see. These, most if not all of these forms of speech or genres occur in other literature. They're not unique to Israel's wisdom texts, but the particular sort of clustering of these kinds of sayings, the didactic way in which these texts work, gives some weight to the notion of a wisdom text. Unless you think, I'll just drop this and get back to it tomorrow, most of us think that the two-line proverb, which if you just open up the book of Proverbs, that's what you see a lot of. The two-line proverb is simple, easily memorizable, pretty basic. This is actually a quite complex speech. No proverb has only one meaning. Every proverb has multiple, they're multivalent sayings. And so much depends on when the proverb is spoken, to who speaks it, to whom do they speak it, what tone they use when they speak it, right? You can imagine a proverb taking on various different meanings depending on all of those factors. So that it's not simple speech. It may be brief speech, but it's not simple speech. And in the Q&A, if you want me to give an example, I'm happy to. There's lots of great studies on Proverbs and the complexity of the two-line proverb. Let me just move to, I'm going to kind of move to the last couple of steps here. It's the complexity of wisdom. It's a tradition and a set of texts. It is a worldview or perspective that's pressing a particular kind of question. It's a discourse. It's a frame of speech that includes a diversity of different genres. Ultimately, I sort of move myself to thinking this is a sort of complex way of being that requires a combination of what I'll call, I'm helped here a lot by one of my teachers in college, Barry Schwartz, who's a psychologist at Swarthmore College, who talks about the practical wisdom of Aristotle, Greeks, as being a combination of moral skill and moral will. Now you see the definitions on the screen, and I want to emphasize that wisdom, when it is best manifest, has both of these qualities. A wise person has moral skill, which is the capacity to really read the room, read what's happening in the immediate context, and to be able to appropriately interpret that and respond intelligently in that moment. So it's a capacity to discern accurately. Paired with moral skill, a wise person will have moral will, which is a disposition. This is the disposition that, as wisdom herself, we'll talk about her tomorrow, wisdom describes herself as loving honesty and justice and beauty, despising wickedness and evil, as she describes it, and striving as best possible to do the right thing, as the right thing is understood in context. Here's the thing. If a person has moral skill and no moral will, the tendency is for that capacity to be used in ways to manipulate the circumstance. So you can have the skill, but if you don't have the paired disposition of justice and neighborliness and a commitment to kindness, you can use moral skill to ill ends. Conversely, I can have moral will, but if I don't have the skill to bring to fruition my commitments to justice or to honesty, I'll often be left without the ability to bring it through to a conclusion. I can't carry it through. Being wise requires this combination of moral skill and moral will. Lastly, before we look at the beginning of just the prologue of Proverbs, so you see it all sort of come together. The last thing is, this is a tradition that assumes, presses its limits. I'd love to pair this with a conversation with Dr. Henkins Davis about Job and about Ecclesiastes. This is a tradition that within itself recognizes the limits of human capacity, recognizes within itself the excesses of human knowing. And it will press up against the edge and then push back on itself. So sometimes we talk about the kind of crisis of wisdom, where people say more than we can say. Our hubris takes us further than our knowledge actually can take us. And the way that we get that sort of boundary, one of the ways we get this boundary on the tradition held, there's a boundary to human wisdom, and that is ultimately God's own wisdom. We don't know past that boundary. And so you get this refrain across the literature of fear of the Lord. What is the posture or the disposition of a wise person? The wise person is a fearer of Yahweh. This is a posture of reverence. This is a posture of awe and the mysterium tremendum, the kind of quaking in your boots in the presence of the holy. This is a conscience that is steeped in seeking to live fully into what God has willed for us. This is a posture, a way of being that also should be manifest, or should manifest, as Proverbs 15:33 and many other texts remind us, in humility. So the wise person is the person who demonstrates humility. I might say it one other way. If somebody comes up to you and says, "I've got it, I am wise," you know in a moment they're an idiot, according to the tradition, because one can never hold and claim to be wise, because in that moment they cease seeking the very thing that we are to devote our lives to seeking. That is the wisdom and the wisdom of God. I think for time, I'm noticing it's 6:25. I think I'll stop, and I can pick up tomorrow. And so I'm at a good breaking point. I will stop sharing my screen. I can always go back. I appreciate, let's see, I appreciate you all kind of hanging with me. This is such a strange environment to try to have an exchange.
Dr. Yoder.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Dr. Yoder, I guess my question is, why are there so many repetitive verses in Proverbs?
Oh, it's such a good question. It's such a good question. So I actually have this real fascination with repetition in the book. I've written a little bit on it. And there is a scholar, this is maybe more than you want to know, but there's a scholar who, as a book project, traced, his name's Daniel Snell, he traced all of the repeated Proverbs in the book and created a remarkable, I'm not kidding you, you buy this book and a flow chart drops out the back that has all of the Proverbs that are repeated verbatim, and all like sort of half lines of Proverbs, 3/4 of a, I mean, there's a lot of repetition in the book. Now, that could be, Mark, to your question, that could be a sign of really bad editing, right? An editor just didn't catch all this repetition. I actually think, and I'd be happy to go into this in more detail, I actually think there's something pedagogically going on. Repetition of a proverb or a half proverb, you're going to encounter the second proverb in a different place in the book. It's going to be surrounded by other proverbs that will invite you to think differently about, I could give you some examples. You're going to think differently about the proverb the second time you see it. Part of what you're discerning or learning is that just because something is repeated word for word doesn't mean that it means or is heard the same way the second time, right? What we also can use repetition in the book to see is that proverbs, even though they have a pattern and are repeated, they are also played with. So you'll see in chapter 19, you can see within 4 verses of each other, basically the same proverb where the only thing that's been changed is one word. And the change intensifies the proverb. It amplifies the proverb. So the sages are teaching, yes, I repeat the proverb, and I can play with the proverb. It's malleable. It's something I can adjust. I also think repetition teaches us something about ourselves. How many of you know that you sort of learn something and then you have to learn it again, right? There's sort of a constant kind of reconstitution of what we know and how we know it. And Proverbs, the book itself, the prologue, which I'll share briefly tomorrow, insists that the audience of the book, the audience of wisdom, isn't just the young or the naive. It is the wise and the discerning. Our entire lives, we are in need of the wisdom that the book contains, or so it purports, which means that we need to keep repeating and learning again what it is we've already learned. Our knowledge gets continually reconstituted. The last thing I'll say is, all of you who are teachers, you know that repetition is a highly effective teaching skill. Repetition is a highly effective teaching skill, right? When you're teaching, how many times do you find yourself repeating yourself? It's a highly effective, right? It's a pedagogy. And these are texts that are teaching.
Same with advertising, by the way.
Yeah, same with advertising. Exactly right. Exactly right.
We can definitely open it up for a few more questions. So who else has a question you'd like to offer to Dr. Yoder? You can either say it by unmuting yourself or you can type it in the chat.
Christine, you said you might take a proverb that sounded very simple and show us it's not quite as simple as it sounds.
Yes. Okay. So I could do this with a biblical one, but I think I'll actually do one with one we know, probably all of us know really well. So when I say the proverb, a rolling stone gathers no moss, what does that proverb mean? So when I'm asking that question, I'm asking you to think, when would you use it? And what are you communicating when you use it? Who would you say it to? And in what context? Anybody want to jump in? A rolling stone gathers no moss.
In a Bob Dylan song?
Do you want to elaborate on that, David?
Oh no, he's the poet, I'm not.
So notice, I hope you're all thinking, well, I could imagine maybe saying that proverb to someone who's always moving and needs to settle down, right? Where moss then is a good thing, right? We want you to settle in, be part of the environment, let a little bit grow on you, right? Stay put. You might also flip it. There are other ways to read the proverb, but an immediate second way to read the proverb is you might say it to someone who's stuck, right? You want to get out of the moss. You need to be rolling. You need to be moving and keeping your life moving forward. So a lot depends on who you're saying it to and how you interpret the key images, just some key words, key phrases within the proverb. So how do you understand a stone that's rolling? How do you understand moss? Are they good things, not good things? Are they qualities to want or not want? All of that influences how you interpret the proverb. I actually worked on that proverb years ago at a conference in Norway. I was at a conference and working on wisdom with them. And I learned more about moss in that conference than I could ever have imagined was possible. But their interpretation of the proverb was, of course, deeply steeped in the ways in which they understood moss and the varieties of it and the virtues of it. So it was, your context will impact, of course, how you interpret and use these proverbs. So no proverb has only one meaning. So much influences. So here's another way to think about it too. It's not enough to know the proverbs. It's not enough to know the tradition. The wise person has to be able, as we talked about earlier, moral skill, to read the context and then think, right? This is knowledge and application. I need to then think about what text, what proverb, what teaching most readily fits into this context? Your pastors do this every Sunday. Every time the kind of connection, in fact, Ecclesiastes, the end of Ecclesiastes describes his work as trying to find an apt or fit saying, something that's pleasing for his community as a preacher and teacher. So you have to be able to put, to use the old image, the newspaper into conversation with the moment. You have to be able to put scripture in conversation with context. That's a wise skill, to be able to find the fitting word that actually speaks to the moment accurately.
Thank you. What other questions do you have for Dr. Yoder tonight?
Would any of you have defined wisdom a lot differently? I know I'm sort of trying to give a sort of big frame before we go into some more details tomorrow, but would any of you have wanted to add or push back on any of the ways we're sort of thinking about wisdom? I'd be curious.
Something that you said earlier in the earlier session today was that wisdom is taking our knowledge and applying it to our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really struck by that. So
yeah, this is why I think sometimes we just don't give it the same kind of attention, because it just feels kind of like something we should be doing all the time. But it is not at all an easy skill, right? To take what we know and set it into action in ways that are about human flourishing, about well-being. I think I've thought a lot about this. Just recently, we had a faculty conversation about what is it we're trying to foster in our master's level students, master's or degree level students. And we named a host of different things that we're hoping we're doing. But we eventually kind of moved ourselves to talking about a sort of cluster, a set of sensibilities. And eventually one of my colleagues said, we're looking for wisdom. We're looking to foster a wisdom that is committed in faith, that is attentive to the world, that is humble and open, that is curious and seeking, that is prayerful, right? Those are that's the sort of set of sensibilities. And that for me has a lot of resonance with what I see this literature seeking to inculcate in its readers. There was something in the chat.
I just sent Christine a question that came in from the chat. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it as you answer?
Oh, yes. So is wisdom framed differently in the New Testament as opposed to the Old, I guess, right? In the New Testament as opposed to Old. Mm-hmm. I'm going to speak a little bit. I don't know who asked that. Or I should look. I should be able to see.
Well, no, it came to me first. It came from
to you privately.
Our colleague down in Boone. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to sort of hold some of this for tomorrow, but there are some differences between particularly Greek notions of wisdom and ancient Israel notions of wisdom. But there's such overlap. And the text that we're going to be even looking at tomorrow, particularly the Wisdom of Solomon, is the same time as the early Christian church. So much of the thinking, it's a Greek Hellenistic text, is influencing the thought world, is influencing the crafters of wisdom, as well as crafting these other texts in the New Testament. And the thread, this is the tradition I think I'm going to end up spending my lifetime trying to just keep renaming. The thread that ties us, the sort of golden thread that ties us from the Old to the New Testament related to wisdom is this figure of personified wisdom, who becomes a very fertile, very vivid tradition from which early Christians drew to talk about the person and work of Christ. So when early Christians were attempting to express this sort of inbreaking, radical gift of Christ, they didn't speak out of nothing. They drew from traditions that they knew. They drew from images and languages and metaphors that they knew. And the wisdom tradition, particularly the tradition around wisdom personified as a woman, that I'm going to trace with you a bit tomorrow, that tradition fed right into some of these early, what we call Christologies, descriptions of Christ. She's also, so John 1 is a great example. If you want to see, if you read Wisdom of Solomon, chapters 7 to 9, and then read John 1, you're going to feel this very proximate connection. Now, it's not the only tradition that the early Christians use. I don't mean for you to hear me say it's the only tradition, but it's a critically important tradition. And many New Testament texts that describe Christ as the wisdom of God, are drawing on this much deeper, very rich tradition that, for me at least, I didn't know this tradition until I started studying wisdom in graduate school. We just didn't talk about it much in my church context. We didn't talk about it very much. So there are some distinctions because we're in different cultural moments between Old and New Testament. But there is a really thick and very important tradition that has traction and relevance between the Old Testament and the New Testament with regard to wisdom. I hope that's helpful.
It was helpful to me, so thank you. But I hope it was helpful to Jeff, who asked the question. We probably have time for about one more question because I want to make sure that we wrap up. I said to Christine before we started, one of the hard things about this Zoom thing is that we can't stay in the fellowship hall and ask her more questions when this formal time is over, which is unfortunate, but we'll be back tomorrow. So is there one other question someone wants to ask tonight?
Dr. Yoder, I've always wondered what the people in the temple thought when a teenage, basically Jesus, were talking to him in terms of wisdom.
Yes. It's a great question. He's out of line. He's out of place. He's speaking inappropriately, but it's quite clear that Jesus knew his wisdom, and he uses wisdom forms when he teaches. He speaks in parables. Proverbs talks about the riddles of the wise, arguably an expression of this kind of parabolic speech, this kind of riddled speech. And Jesus knows his wisdom and certainly manifested in that particular scene you're recalling for us.
But I bet he didn't have gray hair.
Not yet. Yes, not yet. May I just ask, since this is such a whole new venue for this series, is having the PowerPoint helpful? Was that it just sort of either just sort of nodding or giving it? Is that because I don't know if that's distracting or helpful or
No,
it's helpful.
very,
Okay.
very special.
Okay, I will use it again tomorrow. I just didn't know. Some people like it and some people find it difficult. So I just wanted to check your temperatures about that to make sure. I'll use it again tomorrow.
Great.
It's good to be able to read the words that you're actually referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I hope so. And just to give kind of the structure so you can see where I'm trying to draw the line. It's a lot of material. And I know I thought, well, this two-step of starting tonight with kind of what is this we're talking about, and then pivoting tomorrow to what is it the seeker is doing, the one who longs for, desires wisdom. What are the metaphors? That's where we're going to move tomorrow. And really think about, particularly around this figure of personified wisdom that we meet in Proverbs, and then she moves. She's a figure that really strides across texts and time and testaments, and so I want to trace some of these key images associated with her about this pursuit of wisdom. What does it look like? Where do we go? What do we hunger for? How do we value it, and so on. So I'll sort of unpack that much more tomorrow.
Okay, quick question.
Yes.
What is your favorite chapter of the Bible?
Oh, no. No, I'm going to actually not answer that question, if that's okay. I just can't even, no, I just have so many of them.
You talked about Ruth and Esther this morning.
Yep, I love Ruth and Esther. I love Genesis 1 to 3. I don't even know how many Psalms. I really am a big fan of 2nd Isaiah. So Isaiah 40 to 55, love it. In fact, when I pray, I'm constantly drawing on Isaiah, Psalms. I love Job. I think Job is just magisterial. I am just, there's too much. I like a lot of texts.
Sorry for the question.
Dr. Yoder?
It's a great question. And I know some people can just say, here's my chapter and verse, even, but my own experience has been that I get really animated by a number of different texts, and sometimes it's really the circumstances I'm in that bring certain texts to mind as being most dear. Lamentations, when the world's falling apart, the text for me, my favorite text in that moment is to turn, for example, to Lamentations, and so it really for me is quite contextual.
Dr. Yoder?
Yeah.
And perhaps this is sort of a question, maybe if at all worth answering tomorrow. This morning, when you talked about, like in the Lord's Prayer, food and enough, I would like to hear you comment on wisdom and prayer. When do how those, the wise prayer?
Yes.
Because clearly we can make some pretty unwise prayers.
There's no question. Let me think about that a little bit. It is, it's interesting that the tradition itself doesn't, I mean, this little prayer tucked in Proverbs 30 that I preached about this morning, it is sort of unique. It's unique, and there's even some debate about whether it can be properly understood as a prayer. I happen to think it's directed to God. It's speech that's asking God for a particular kind of quality of life. I'd construe it to be a prayer. But there isn't a lot of attention in wisdom literature, particularly around what we would consider religious observances. So temple sacrifices and prayer and sort of cultic regulations. That's one way in which this literature seems to stand separate. But the struggle for faithful speech, which is part of what I hear in your question, is very much part of this tradition. So, I think about Job's friends, for example, trying to bring the best of tradition to interpret the suffering of their friend, trying in fact to comfort their friend. They're not necessarily offering prayer per se, but they're trying to find fitting speech. Of course, it doesn't address the suffering that Job is in. It doesn't recognize his reality. It doesn't hear his story. His lament, where he asks, for the unraveling of the day of his birth, that feels prayer-like to me. That's a lament. So there is some of this in the tradition, but it's not a tradition that presses into the arena of sort of criteria for prayer or sort of more formal expressions of that.
I know that we could keep asking questions for a long time. And I hope maybe you'll think up what some of your other questions are, like Shirley just offered one to say maybe to talk about tomorrow. Bring those questions with you, and we will gather on Zoom again tomorrow at 5:30, and hope that you'll share that with friends and neighbors, that they'll consider joining us as well. And we are live streaming this to YouTube as well. So folks don't have the Zoom link, they can catch it there. And the video, I neglected to start the recording at the beginning, but most of this lecture will be recorded, or else all that's been streamed to YouTube, which was from the beginning of the lecture. So hopefully folks will be able to catch all of it there. So thank you again to Dr. Yoder for sharing this time with us, for imparting your wisdom to us. We are very grateful, and thank you all for being with us tonight. Peace be with you, and we'll see you tomorrow at 5:30.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoder.
Have a good night.
Thank you, you too.